My name is Samuel Grant, 52 years old, Senior Risk Audit Specialist at Frontier Meridian Holdings in Houston. 30 years in the energy sector might sound long to other people, but to me, it is simply a chain of days spent standing between two things: risk and responsibility. I am not the type who talks much about my work, partly because it is dry, partly because most people would not understand why a report off by 3 digits can bring down a multi-million-dollar deal. But that morning at 7:48 a.m., I knew I was about to step into a phase where many people, even the ones who used to treat me like a piece of office furniture, would be forced to care about what I do. The door swung open without a knock. I had not even raised my head when Lucas Harrow was already standing in front of me. The chairman's son, 30 years old, hair slicked back with too much gel, carrying the swagger of someone who has never faced consequences for any decision he has ever made. He tossed a piece of paper onto my desk the way someone throws a bar receipt. The only words coming out of his mouth were effective immediately. No explanation, no reason. His voice was dry and hollow, as if he were reading a paragraph he did not understand himself. I looked down at the paper. A termination notice. And in the upper right corner, the timestamp marked to the second, exactly 48 hours before my $78,000 bonus was scheduled to be paid out. Money that anyone with even minimal sense would know not to touch. Lucas probably thought this was a smart move, a neat way to cut costs by trimming off a seasoned employee. But when I looked at him, I knew he had just done the riskiest thing he would ever do. Not because he fired me, but because he had just triggered the exact clause the company's founder created to protect the system from people like him. Lucas went on about strategy, efficiency, and restructuring. He sounded no different from a restaurant patron reading a pasta menu and unsure how to pronounce linguine. I did not react. I just looked at him the way you look at someone driving a sports car without understanding how power steering works. When he finished talking, I simply capped my pen and stood up. He seemed surprised that I did not argue. Fired employees usually get angry, or at least ask why. But I only placed my hand on the desk for a moment, as if offering a quiet farewell, because I knew exactly what clause he had just activated. A clause Frontier Meridian had long forgotten, but I never had. I stepped into the hallway. My footsteps echoed along the long, bright corridor. No one turned around, but I knew they all heard the door when Lucas barged in. The elevator opened. I stepped inside and looked at my reflection in the metal. No anger, no confusion, just an uncanny calm, as I had finally set down a heavy suitcase I had been carrying for far too long. When I passed the security desk, Mr. Jim, the man who had watched over this building for more than 2 decades, glanced at the paper in my hand, then at me. "Mr. Grant, him again." I nodded. "Yes, him again." Mr. Jim exhaled, the kind of knowing sigh of someone who has witnessed too much foolishness born from a wealthy last name. I walked out into the Houston morning. The air was still gentle. The sky was high, the sun not harsh yet, the breeze soft enough to stir my shirt. I paused for a second, inhaled deeply, then headed toward the parking lot. No one followed me. No one asked questions, but I did not need that. The moment I stepped out of the building, I felt lighter than someone who had just lost their job ought to feel. And right here, I should probably say the thing I would normally place at the beginning. Before I tell the rest of the story, I want to ask where you are listening from. The dusty winds of Texas, the cold snow of Minnesota, or the quiet streets of Ohio. At this age, a map is not for showing off where you have been. It is to see who your story still manages to reach. Young people want to know where they are going. I just want to know who is walking with me for the next few minutes. When I unlocked my small midtown apartment, I set my keys down and sat in my familiar chair. I did not feel angry. I did not feel robbed. There was only one thing clear and steady in my mind. Lucas Harrow had just triggered something he did not understand at all. But I understood it perfectly. And from that moment on, the clock had already started. Some people like standing under the lights. As for me, the past 30 years have been spent living beneath the underground lines that keep those lights burning. I have never been the sort of employee who steps onto a stage, grabs a microphone, and claims credit. My work does not create sparkling moments. It only creates stability. And stability, as you know, is never celebrated while it exists. Only when it disappears do people remember its value. I began my career in Montana, where the fields were wide enough to swallow the horizon, and the wind never stopped blowing. I was a young audit engineer fresh out of school, hands still shaking when I signed my first report. The company was small then, with no fancy conference rooms or electronic boards flashing numbers. We worked in rooms that smelled of machine oil, and every incorrect figure carried the risk of an entire pipeline faltering. I learned to read each line of data the way you read the lines on someone's face. One small irregular beat, and I knew something was happening. Years passed. I moved to Colorado, then Oklahoma, and finally Houston. I climbed the system not because I was better than anyone else, but because I was always the first person they called when things began to shake. From an audit engineer, I became the one responsible for assessing risk for the largest pipeline projects along the Gulf Coast. If anyone asked for my secret, I would say there was none. Only one simple habit: check, check, and check again. But the biggest turning point of my career did not happen on a job site. It happened in a small Frontier Meridian Holdings office that year. I remember very clearly the first day I met the first-generation founder, Randall Pierce. A tall, thin man, hair more silver than black, but eyes sharp and quick like someone far younger. He did not ask me the usual interview questions. He only asked one thing. "Do you know what the scariest thing in the energy industry is?" I guessed randomly. "Fire, pipeline failures, environmental impact." He shook his head. "No, the scariest thing is assuming everything will work the same as it did yesterday." That sentence changed the way I saw my work. At Frontier, Pierce gave me a task I did not fully understand at the time: build a financial risk control system that could function like the company's second brain. A system capable of predicting, alerting, and self-correcting when deviations appear. It took 12 years to complete the Meridian compliance kernel. It was not the kind of software people turn on and off when needed. It was the neural network of the entire trading system, the audit records, and every block of data tied to the validity of major deals. One incorrect signature, one mismatched date, one data line outside its allowed range, and the kernel would flag it, lock it, or send an alert straight to the responsible party. And that responsible party was me. In a final meeting before Pierce retired, he called me aside. The two of us stood in the control room with blue-lit data screens. He placed his hand on my shoulder and said something I will never forget. "The precious things must be bound to the right hands." Then he handed me a contract addendum. It was the foundation of the hidden clause that Lucas accidentally triggered this morning. Pierce tied the Meridian kernel to my bonus so that anyone who tried to change the system supervisor would have to follow regulations written down to the letter. If not, the kernel would automatically revoke access, and any deal dependent on it would become invalid. At that time, I never imagined that clause would one day become the spark that burned down a deal worth $210 million. During the 12 years of building the kernel, I practically lived in the office. But my personal life was calm to the point where I sometimes felt like two different people. I lived in a small apartment in Midtown, not luxurious but warm enough. Every morning I read a newspaper, a habit many people told me to drop because no one opens a real paper anymore. I also took my elderly mother to her regular medical appointments. She lived in the Katy suburbs, eyesight fading, but hearing sharp enough to ask me why I sighed each time she noticed. I never told her how important the kernel was. To her, my work was just numbers and spreadsheets. At Frontier, people never truly understood the system I built. They only knew things ran smoothly when I was still there. Just like how people in a big city never know there are hundreds of electrical lines, gas pipes, and water conduits beneath them. They only care that the lights stay on, the water flows, and the air conditioning works. But if someone asked who understood every hidden line underneath, the answer was only one. And inside Frontier, that person was me. No one except me knew the kernel's core design. No one knew the root security keys. No one knew the intersection points that allowed the system to lock an entire deal over a single small violation. That made me irreplaceable, not because I wanted to be, but because Pierce engineered the system that way to protect it from the ignorant but powerful. Looking back at 30 years, I never imagined one day I would be fired from the very place I helped keep alive all my life. But this morning, when Lucas threw the termination notice onto my desk, I realized Pierce had seen farther than any of us. He had bound the most precious thing to the person he trusted would never let it fall. And he was right. The Colonel is still exactly where it needs to be. And this story, in truth, is only just beginning. Some people inherit wealth, while others inherit illusions. I once heard someone say that during a leadership seminar. Back then, I just laughed. However, after everything I have witnessed with Lucas Harrow, I now believe that sentence deserves to be printed in every risk management textbook. Lucas, at 30, carried the look of someone spoiled since childhood, and the way he walked into the office every morning always resembled an actor performing a role in a movie where he believed he was the protagonist. Frontier Meridian Holdings saw him as part of the company's future. I saw something else, a layer of immaturity wrapped in expensive suits, a kind of illusion inflated by the Harrow surname rather than competence. He once bragged to me about two clean energy startups he claimed to have built. The problem was that one shut down after 8 months for failing safety standards, and the other was fined for using fabricated data to secure funding. Yet every time Lucas told the story, his tone carried a smugness, as if those two failures were opening chapters of some grand success memoir. But what caught my attention the most was not that showmanship. It was his attitude toward expertise. Lucas talked about auditing and risk the way someone might read a pasta menu in an Italian restaurant, pronouncing things smoothly but having no idea how the dishes were made. He was very good at stringing impressive-sounding words together without understanding they did not belong in the same sentence. However, the moment that truly raised my suspicion did not come from his words, but from something that happened 4 months ago. We were running transaction reports to prepare documentation for a critical phase of the $210 million deal. The Colonel detected a slight timing discrepancy in a payment window, one sensitive enough to require immediate review. But when I opened the system, that report had disappeared from the summary page. I will never forget the chill running down my spine when I saw the traces being altered. The Colonel logs every action, every person who touches it. And in the user note line, Lucas's name appeared. He was not skilled enough to erase the trail, but reckless enough to try hiding the error. I confronted him that same afternoon, directly asking about the inconsistency. He laughed, shrugged, and said something I can still hear word for word. "Mr. Grant, stop nitpicking small errors like that. I just helped clean the system a bit." Clean. To him, erasing a flawed report was cleaning. To me, it was sabotaging the foundation of risk control, but I had no chance to investigate further. The board pushed me into an urgent project, and Lucas suddenly appeared more frequently in strategic meetings. From that moment, I knew the termination this morning was no coincidence. He needed me gone before anyone followed that altered trace back to him. Then the $210 million deal appeared like an opportunity for Lucas to prove his worth. He needed a grand mark, a triumph to say he was more than the chairman's son. And to achieve that, he needed me out of the way, not sitting beside him in a conference room asking technical questions he could never answer. Throughout the 8 months leading to the deal, Lucas shadowed the board, shadowed communications, shadowed everything except the work that actually mattered. I saw the irritation in his eyes each time people turned to me instead of him. That envy was not the envy of a leader. It was the envy of a child who sees a classmate perform better, but still wants to be the one the teacher calls on. As the final negotiation day approached, he grew more anxious. I once saw him standing at the conference room door, gripping a stack of papers so tightly the edges curled, his eyes locked on the participant list. My name sat under technical oversight, and I knew that alone kept him awake at night. Someone like Lucas could not bear the reality that in a deal of that scale, the credit would go to a 52-year-old man working silently in a windowless room rather than to him. So on the morning I was fired, I was not surprised. I was only mildly amused that he had done it so early. Lucas believed removing me from Frontier would help him cover mistakes, steal credit, and silence doubt before the $210 million contract closed. But he did not know the Colonel was bound to me by a mechanism only Pierce and I fully understood. He did not know that firing me 3 days before the bonus deadline was the fastest way to trigger the hidden clause Pierce had left behind. He did not know that ignorance can create a louder explosion than deliberate destruction. And the most important thing, he did not know that the man he tried to eliminate was the only person he needed to keep the $210 million deal from turning into ashes. Lucas thought he had delivered the decisive blow, the move that knocked me off the board. But people who talk most loudly about winning are often the ones who never see the move that places them in checkmate. As for me, that morning I simply walked out calmly because I already knew something he had no idea about. Lucas Harrow had just opened the door leading directly to the collapse of the very dream he was trying to claim. While they scrambled for answers, I simply watched the clock and counted each breath. Even though the Frontier building still operated as usual, I knew that in just a few hours, the people who believed they controlled everything would understand what it meant when the system refused to obey them. I hung my coat on the chair and powered on the computer in my small workroom. No one at Frontier knew this place existed. This was where I had checked the kernel's configuration for years. When the dashboard appeared, a timer stood out against the dark background. 47 hours, 58 minutes. That was the time left before the hidden clause fully activated. The clause was embedded both in my contract and within the structure of the Meridian compliance kernel. If my bonus was paid on time while I remained an employee, Frontier retained the right to use the kernel. If either condition was broken, the countdown began. When the time expired, the clean licensing rights would be revoked, and every deal built on the kernel would shift into dispute status. No buttons needed pressing. The kernel executed it automatically. Pierce and I had spent many evenings designing this mechanism. He always said that whatever was precious must be tied to the right hands. 3 generations of leadership had come and gone, yet that truth had never failed. Below the timer was a notification rule I had configured when Frontier began negotiating with Orion Utilities. I set up an automatic email. If the clock reached 0 while the bonus remained unpaid, and I was no longer an employee, the system would send a technical notice directly to Orion's legal team, stating that Frontier no longer held valid licensing rights for the kernel. That alone. In the world of $200 million contracts, a single sentence like that could blow up an entire meeting. The clock turned to 47 hours, 57 minutes. I thought of Lucas. He had read the termination notice as if compliance systems worked on goodwill. From the confidence on his face this morning, I was certain he had never understood that some mechanisms operated beyond the reach of titles or family power. I opened an old note file, reviewing the times the kernel had automatically blocked discrepancies before anyone could cause major damage. Frontier had thanked me, but only because I stood in the room at the time. The kernel was the one doing the work. Today would be no different. I did not need to speak. The system would speak for me. I stood to make a pot of tea. When I returned, the steam curled in front of the screen. I opened a new note page and wrote 3 lines. The moment Lucas signed the termination, the moment the system updated my employment status, and the bonus payout deadline. 3 points forming a straight line, clear and irreversible. Many would ask why I did not call Frontier to warn them. The answer was simple. A chance to fix something must be taken before breaking it. Lucas had that chance when he hid the flawed report. When I warned him, when Pierce was still on the board. He ignored all of it, and this morning he still believed that titles alone could erase mistakes. I chose silence, not as revenge, but because this clause was created to remain untouched by emotion. The kernel did not love, did not hate, did not gloat. It only executed what it was programmed to do. I took a sip of tea and looked out the window. Midday, Houston was loud, but this room was not. The timer shifted to 47 hours and 51 minutes. I pictured Lucas enthusiastically presenting in some conference room, completely unaware that events were steering toward a place he could not possibly recover from. I reopened the countdown. The numbers moved steadily, perfectly precise. A status line appeared. System awaiting bonus update. Of course, no update was coming. Lucas thought firing me would be clean and quick. He did not know Frontier had placed its hand directly into the trap the founder had built to protect the company from reckless decisions. I leaned back in the chair. This was not satisfactory. This was clarity. Frontier had always believed the kernel was a tool, But the kernel had never been a tool serving people. It served only the principles it was built. I added a few more lines to my notes. Not for reporting, not for defense, only to remind myself that from the moment Lucas tossed that paper onto my desk, the story no longer rested in his hands. Everything had been decided 12 years ago when Pierce and I signed the final update. I turned off the desk lamp, but the screen stayed bright. The timer kept running. I did not call anyone. I did not send emails. I did not explain myself. I only did the one thing someone who truly understands the system would do. Wait, and let what must happen, happen. In the world of risk, silence is not surrender. Silence is knowing you placed the first stone in the right spot. And from that point on, gravity would take care of the rest. Major collapses always begin with a small email. People think it takes a loud explosion, a tense meeting, or a dramatic scandal to shake $100 million deal. But in the world I have lived in for 30 years, the most damage always comes from a cold notification, only a few sentences long. I received that email at 8:04 the next morning from Orion Utilities. The subject line was so simple that it was almost emotionless. Urgent request to verify the validity status of Mr. Samuel Grant. The message contained only 3 lines. The licensing certification tied to my name, the certification they needed for the $210 million deal to proceed, had disappeared from Frontier's legal records. They demanded that Frontier provide the latest certified copy within 12 hours, along with a clear explanation of why the certification no longer matched the system data. I sat still and looked at the email. No surprise, no satisfaction. Only the familiar feeling of someone watching the first brick slip from a wall, knowing the others will follow. The timer at that moment showed around 38 hours left. The kernel was still running exactly as it should. Across the city, Frontier's glass tower was no doubt heating up. I did not need cameras to imagine the scene. The legal department would be tearing through archives, scrutinizing every clause, opening every old scan. Some would blame the storage system. Some would blame a typing error. And certainly someone would start looking at Lucas. I poured more tea. No rush, no curiosity. Corporate crises always follow the same unchanging pattern. First doubt, then denial, and finally chaos. Around 9:30, my phone vibrated. Not Lucas, not human resources. A text from Mr. Davenport, a board member I had always respected for preferring the blunt truth over flattery. Mr. Grant, is there anything we should know? I stared at the message for a moment. It was the kind of question asked by someone hoping you would give a long explanation, a path for them to pin the blame elsewhere. But I had nothing to say. I replied with exactly 3 words. Read the contract. I knew I did not need to add anything. Contracts always tell the truth. The problem is that people rarely read them when it actually matters. A few minutes later, another message appeared, not from Davenport, from an unfamiliar number with a New York area code. Only one question. Is Clause 72B exactly as written in the version I am looking at? I set the phone down and allowed myself a slight smile. They had finally found the clause, the one Pierce had tucked into the appendix, where most people skim for formality. It was the first brick in the kernel's wall, and also the first to fall if someone struck the wrong point. I did not reply to the second message. The sender did not need my confirmation. They were merely hoping a miracle existed, and the clause did not carry legal force. But in the system I built, there were no miracles. Only logic. At 10:20, the news began leaking. First through a small financial bulletin where reporters enjoyed sniffing out irregularities. Then a few energy sector bloggers began posting about Frontier facing a potential technical issue in its deal with Orion. From suspicion to doubt, people would soon shift to conclusions. Rumors always travel faster than reports. I glanced at the text running across the small television in my kitchen corner. A source indicates Frontier may be facing instability related to its internal compliance system. No mention of my name, no mention of Lucas. But I knew this was only the beginning. By 11 o'clock, a former colleague called me. I did not answer. I knew they would ask the familiar question everyone asks in a crisis. Are you hiding something? Since walking out of that building, I owed no one an explanation. This time, I let them find their own way. I thought of Lucas. He was likely still pretending to be confident. I could imagine him standing in a conference room, hands in his pockets, a half smile on his face, insisting everything was under control. Those accustomed to flattering him would nod along. Those with experience would begin sensing something was off. In every crisis, there is always someone like Lucas. They mistake illusion for competence, believing that if they speak loudly enough, reality will soften. But reality does not soften. It simply stands there, waiting for someone to step back and look directly at it. Near noon, Orion's communications office sent another email. Not to me, but to Frontier. Yet a copy somehow drifted to my old address. The opening line could not have been colder. If Frontier cannot provide a valid certification by the deadline, the deal will be reassessed from the beginning. I read it once and closed it, not because I was concerned for them, but because I understood that from the moment that email was sent, Frontier's so-called fortress had begun showing unmistakable fractures. People can block rumors, rebuild their image, adjust reports, and shift responsibility. But no one can patch a clause that has already been triggered. The clock on my screen then showed 36 hours, 23 minutes remaining. The colonel was still running silently. Lucas was still performing his confidence act. The executive team was still in back-to-back meetings. And I was still in that small room finishing my cooling cup of tea. The wall had not yet collapsed, but the cracks were visible. And everyone knows that once a wall starts to crack, it never stops at one. In the most critical moments, real power belongs to the one who stays silent. I have seen that hundreds of times over 3 decades. The person who shouts the loudest is usually the one losing control. The one who talks the most is usually the one most afraid. And the one who stays quiet, if they truly understand what is happening, is the one holding the key to every outcome. My phone vibrated at 2:17 in the afternoon. The screen showed the name Lucas Harrow. I was not surprised. The rumors had grown loud enough to force someone like him to pick up the phone. I let it ring 3 times before answering. Lucas's voice came immediately, trying to force itself down a notch to sound steady, but trembling at the end like a string pulled too tight. "Mr. Grant, we need to talk." I replied, even in slow, "I am listening." Lucas exhaled hard, then began blaming others in the exact order I had predicted. "We think the storage system failed. The tech department says the data might have been synced incorrectly. Legal says maybe an old version of the contract was digitized wrong. I am working to fix this, but you know how it is. A few careless people can make everything fall apart." He spoke quickly, as if speaking faster would make the truth race forward to match him. I listened until he stopped, then answered, my tone flat as glass. "It is not a system error." I heard Lucas swallow. He switched direction. "Then tech messed up. I knew they were unreliable. I will have all access logs reviewed. I just need you to confirm the clause was not triggered by mistake." I spoke even slower, slicing the words thin. Nothing was a mistake. Silence stretched on the other end. For the first time all day, Lucas said nothing. I heard him pacing on a conference room floor, the sharp rhythm of his shoes hitting the ground. Then his voice returned, smaller but sharper, like someone standing on a cliff edge. "What is this? Why did your certification disappear from our records?" "Orion is pressing us. Legal cannot explain. If you know something, I need you to say it now." His voice was stretched tight like a drawn bowstring. I leaned back and took a sip of nearly cold tea. "Lucas," I said, "read the contract." He let out a harsh breath, almost a growl. "This is not the time for games. I need you to explain right now or else." I cut him off gently, the way you set a notebook on a table. "Lucas, the clause took effect the moment you signed my termination." I am certain Lucas had never experienced the feeling I heard in the silence that followed. A pause filled with panic, held under pressure. Then he pivoted, grasping at a new angle to place blame. "I do not know what nonsense is in your contract. Legal clearly did not do their job. They must have slipped it in by mistake." "No," I said, "that clause was placed there by the founder. It has nothing to do with the current legal staff." Another pause. Then he shifted to a tactic used by desperate people trying to keep their pride intact. Mr. Grant, we can resolve this in a better way. I can propose that the board restore your bonus, even increase it. If you come back to fix the certification issue, I can push for a regional risk oversight role with new authority. Better pay. Everything is negotiable. My voice did not change, did not rise, did not lower. You did not choose me when you had the chance. This time, Lucas could not hold the mask. Do not talk like that. You are putting the whole company in danger. Do you even understand how important this deal is? You think you are winning. You think you have the right. I cut in. Lucas, you signed the decision, and the colonel is simply doing its job. Something hit the table on his end. Then Lucas's voice cracked. The arrogance gone, leaving only the panic of someone realizing they have activated something beyond their control. You have to stop this, right now. Do you hear me? You have to. I moved the phone slightly away from my ear, and before he shifted into pleading, which I knew would come next, I said the final sentence. I no longer belong to Frontier. Then I ended the call. The room returned to its soft, clean silence, like the surface of a still lake. In the pale light falling through the window, my computer screen displayed the familiar line. Time remaining, 26 hours. I sat back and drew a slow breath. No gauche, no triumph, no regret. Only the feeling that everything was moving along the exact trajectory a strictly engineered system was meant to follow. Somewhere else, Lucas was drowning in the chaos he created. And I, the quiet one in this moment, was the only person who knew exactly what would happen next. There are moments when an entire building realizes it has been standing on a rotten foundation. The next morning I woke with a strange quietness, not the calm of someone who has won, but the silence of someone who saw the earthquake coming 3 days before it hit. The sun had not fully risen, but my phone screen was already glowing with alerts. Financial news outlets had begun reporting. No longer the faint whispers of the previous day. This time, the headlines were heavy, aimed directly at the weakness Frontier had always tried to hide. The Frontier-Orion deal was shaking. Some reports said plainly that the deal could collapse at any moment without the valid certification from the control system I designed. I scrolled. Frontier's stock was down more than 10% in the morning alone. A simple number to read, but for an energy corporation, it was a slide no one wanted to see. Investors have no patience, especially after months of hearing about an imminent $100 million success. I could picture the grim faces on video calls, the barrage of emails demanding explanations, the executives being pushed to produce answers. I sat at the table and brewed a cup of hot tea. No hurry, no anxiety. Morning Earl Grey had kept me steady for years. I had barely taken the first sip when my phone rang again. Not Lucas, not Frontier. The number belonged to a place far more familiar, the executive office of Orion Utilities. I picked up. The voice on the other end was steady and deep, not a hint of tremor. It was Jonathan Reeve, Chief Executive Officer of Orion, known for moving slowly but cutting precisely, like a scalpel. Mr. Grant, we need to verify something. Does Frontier still hold valid rights to the Meridian Compliance Kernel? No small talk, no courtesy. One question, straight to the heart of $210 million. I looked out the window. Morning sunlight hit the planter outside. The neighbor's cat stretched on the steps. Everything is peaceful, in stark contrast to the storm roaring through Frontier's upper floors. I answered, they do not, and they cannot regain it. A pause, but not the shocked kind. More like someone hearing what he has long suspected and is now confirming. Very clear, Mr. Reeves said. I understand. Then his voice dropped slightly, as if he had stepped out of a conference room to avoid eager ears. Our board has suspected this. They believe Frontier attempted to hide the loss of ownership. We cannot take that risk. Samuel, we will make our decision today. The call ended, just a few short sentences, but enough for me to know what was coming. An hour later, Orion's press release appeared across major news outlets. The $210 million deal was canceled. No delays, no renegotiation. Fully terminated. The reason was stated plainly. Frontier could not provide a valid ownership certification for the core kernel. I did not need to read more. I knew Frontier's internal state must have exploded by then. Lucas cornered the board firing questions nonstop. Chief Executive Officer Raines likely rushing from Chicago to Houston. Department heads scrambling to avoid blame. Someone once said that when a ship sinks, you learn who actually knows how to swim. Lucas did not know how to swim. That afternoon, I received a second call from Orion. Still Jonathan Reeve, but this time his tone carried a softness I had never heard during 8 months of negotiations. Samuel, I want to say this privately, not in any meeting. I waited. I have long noticed the stability of the Colonel, the way it operates, the way it prevents risk before anyone sees it. It is unlike any system Frontier has ever used, and it reflects one thing very clearly. The person who built it understands his work down to the bone. I allowed myself a small smile. Few executives in this industry look that deeply. Reeve continued, I know Frontier will try everything to pull you back, but if you are open to collaboration, we are willing to create a completely independent working structure. You would not have to become an Orion employee. We only ask to continue working with the Colonel under your ownership. Not a flashy offer, not a shiny promise, just a door opened with respect. And in this world, respect is the rarest currency. I rested my arm on the chair, watching the late afternoon light stretch across the floor. Everything happened exactly like a domino chain I had seen the moment Lucas threw that termination paper onto my desk. The breaking point always comes from the person who believes they are the anchor. I ended that day with a feeling not of victory, but of confirmation. That those who work quietly, who do what must be done, will eventually have a moment when the entire building has to turn and look back at them. Today was that moment. Silent victories have no fireworks, only a single line that reads transfer complete. That night, I sat in my small workroom, the same old wooden desk in front of me, and a pot of Earl Grey still releasing gentle steam. Outside the window, Houston sank under the golden glow from tall buildings. The streets slick with dew as if covered by a thin silver glaze. The whole city looked busy, but inside my room there was only one sound. The steady tick of the clock, each beat landing like a tap on the palm of my hand. 2 minutes left. I watched the countdown on my laptop screen. Red numbers pulsing coldly like the heartbeat of a machine incapable of lying. It was not Frontier's clock, not third-party data. It was the personal audit system I had built years ago, designed to record every critical moment tied to the Meridian compliance kernel. 1 minute 30 seconds, no shouting, no one is running to pound on my door, no last-minute intervention from Lucas or the board. Everything was unfolding exactly in the order they had triggered when they tossed that termination notice onto my desk. 1 minute, I thought back to the past 2 days. The frantic calls, the headlines about the stock plunging. Lucas was trying to stay upright in the conference room while his voice trembled like someone pressed against a wall. Orion behaves like a wild animal catching scent of danger from miles away. And me, steady in the middle of it all, 40 seconds. I set the teapot aside and leaned back in my chair. Perhaps at my age, people no longer look for loud victories. They simply want one thing, for everything to fall back into the place it belongs. 20 seconds. I recalled what Reeves said yesterday. He told me the kernel reflected the person who designed it. A system stable, quiet, never bragging, but immovable once its mechanism is locked. I said nothing then, but now in this silent room, I allowed myself a slight smile. 10 seconds. Nothing more needed to be said. 3, 2, 1. Then the screen flickered. Transfer complete. No sound, no animation. Only a single line of text, yet heavy enough to collapse a $210 million deal. The Meridian compliance kernel had transferred full legal ownership to me. From that moment, Frontier Meridian Holdings no longer held any right to access, modify, or use the system. No paperwork could undo it. No emergency meeting could patch the breach they created. They did not just lose ownership, they lost the foundation of the largest deal in the company's history. I opened the folder containing the ownership documents. Again, the name Samuel Grant sat neatly under the owner field. The black letters on white background looked calm, as if this had always been true and only everyone else had failed to notice. Across the city, I could imagine the chaos inside Frontier. Conference room doors slamming open, people racing to speak, then racing to shift blame. Lucas no doubt trying to defend himself, but with the way he talked, every explanation would become evidence against him. Then I thought of Chairman Harrow, a man who had carried Frontier for decades, now losing his position because of his own son. The board suspended him that same afternoon as news of the deal's collapse spread. In their eyes, Lucas's carelessness was also his responsibility. A powerful family losing everything because of one reckless termination paper. I returned to my tea. The water had cooled, but the familiar scent still lingered, soft as the breath of an early season morning. I inhaled deeply and opened my email folder. One draft sat there, unsent, containing only 3 words: Exact Nyan. It had been prepared 2 days earlier. With one click, my attorney would know every legal step was complete and the colonel's ownership secured beyond dispute. I clicked. The email vanished. No triumph, no loud laughter, only the sense that everything was closing exactly as it should. I stood and stepped onto the porch. Dawn had just reached Houston. A pale pink light brushed across the sky like a gentle stroke of paint. The morning breeze was not cold, just enough to remind me that my shoulders felt lighter. 30 years. 30 years working with numbers, risks, and financial scenarios that most people could never fully grasp. 30 years in the shadows of a profession where precision matters more than applause. Today, for the first time, I felt I had stepped entirely out of that shadow. Not with a punch, but with a single line. Transfer complete. I watched the light spread across the street, feeling a peace deeper than any loud victory could offer. Some lives do not need fireworks to mark a turning point, only a quiet morning, and a new chapter is opening in the cleanest way possible. Tomorrow would bring more to do. But in this moment, I let myself be still, just for one day, to feel my shoulders lighten after 30 years. Then I returned to my desk. Not rushed, not hurried. This story is not finished. But those who caused it have likely learned a lesson they never imagined they needed. Some roads only appear when you dare to walk away from the place that once hurt you. The morning after the colonel transferred ownership, I allowed myself one full day to do something I had not allowed in 30 years. Sit still, no report fixing, no risk checks, no contract reviews, just sitting still and letting the shoulders that had carried a responsibility for decades loosen for a moment. But that quiet did not last long. By the next afternoon, Orion's office sent an official invitation. Not a full-time contract, not an offer to buy the colonel, just one very clear line. To Mr. Samuel Grant, Orion wishes to collaborate with you as an independent advisor for next-generation risk control projects. I read the sentence again and again, feeling the respect in every word. Respect was something Frontier had never offered me after Pierce passed away, and it was something I knew I could no longer overlook. 2 days later, I signed the collaboration agreement. No fanfare, no press conference, no staged handshakes in front of cameras. Just a mild morning sun, Reeve and I sitting in a small meeting room at Orion, one wooden table, 2 cups of coffee, and a clean contract. Reeve spoke in his usual slow and steady tone. We are not hiring you. We are choosing to work with you. That sentence to me weighed more than the $210 million of the abandoned deal. After leaving Orion, I called 3 longtime friends in the industry, the ones who had always wanted to build an independent audit platform but never had the chance to start. We met at a small cafe near Buffalo Bayou. 4 men with graying hair sat together, sketching the first outlines of a new risk consulting group. Small, just 3 people, one project at a time. No scrambling, no chasing contracts. I once thought I would work alone until the end of my life. But it turns out some journeys begin only when you think everything has closed. Near dusk, as I was reviewing the design of the new platform, my phone lit up with a message. It was from Thomas, a former colleague at Frontier. Only a few words. I am sorry for staying silent. I looked at that line for a long time. Over the years we worked together, I knew he was not a bad man. Just someone afraid of losing his position, afraid Lucas would notice him, afraid to say anything that might turn the room against him. In that world, silence was sometimes the cheapest armor a person could find. I replied, I understand. No blame, no sarcasm. I had lived long enough to know some people can only be brave once everything is over. That evening, I sat on my porch. Houston had turned into a deep violet, a color too beautiful for a noisy city. A gentle breeze carried the scent of dry leaves in the last warmth of the day. I thought of my mother, a gentle woman with a sentence she repeated hundreds of times throughout my childhood. Justice does not need to shout. As a child, I did not understand such things, but 30 years in risk auditing taught me she was right. Justice is not shouting, slamming tables, or taking loud revenge. Justice is when the truth is put back in its rightful place. The hand that created the mistake must bear the consequence. When an entire corporation must finally acknowledge what it once ignored. I looked back at my own journey. 30 years of fixing the errors of others. 30 years of stopping risks no one could see. 30 years working in the dim corners of a profession where the work matters, but the person doing it is forgotten. And finally, in the exact second the kernel returned to its rightful ownership, I reclaimed what had always belonged to me. Not money, not reputation, but the truth. I placed my hand on the table, feeling a lightness as if the burden of 3 decades had lifted from my shoulders. A new path lay ahead, quiet but clear, and this time I would walk not with silent endurance, but with the calm of someone who has seen the price of being underestimated. If this story reminds you of a time you were overlooked, leave a line. And if you want to hear more stories about silent justice in the American workplace, hit subscribe. At this age, we do not need noise. We need truth.